It was a rainy October evening when I checked into the small, run-down motel on the outskirts of a quiet town in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of place you book when you're desperate for a bed and too tired to care. The clerk, an older man with watery eyes and a too-wide smile, handed me the key to room 209. "Not much, but it's clean," he said. His words sounded more like a warning than reassurance. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew, the carpet a dull red worn thin in patches. My room was as basic as it got: a single bed, a tiny TV bolted to the wall, and an old wooden desk that had seen better days. The window overlooked a dimly lit parking lot, where the rain tapped a soft rhythm against the glass. I was exhausted from driving all day, so I decided to call it an early night. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise, a sharp thud from the room next door, room 211. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just someone dropping their suitcase. But then it happened again, and again. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone banging something heavy against the wall. I glanced over at the clock, 12:37 a.m. Annoyed, I got up and put my ear to the thin wall. The sound was louder now, more distinct. It wasn't just a banging sound. It was dragging, too, like something heavy being scraped across the floor. I thought about calling the front desk, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check it out for myself. Grabbing my key, I stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows. Room 211 was just a few steps away. I knocked lightly on the door. "Hey, hello? Everything okay in there?" No response. I knocked again, louder this time. "Hey, I'm in the room next door. Could you keep it down?" Still nothing. That's when I noticed the faintest sound. Breathing. Slow, heavy breaths coming from the other side of the door. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself to turn around, go back to my room, and let the front desk handle it. But instead, I bent down and peeked through the keyhole. The room was dark, but I could make out a figure standing in the center. Tall and gaunt, their silhouette barely illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at the door, staring at me. Suddenly, the breathing stopped, and then without warning, the doorknob started to turn, slowly, deliberately. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and bolted back to my room. Slamming the door shut, I locked it and shoved my desk against it for good measure. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for my phone to call the front desk. Before I could dial, there was a knock at my door. 3 slow knocks. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. No response, just another knock, and another knock. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching a lamp like it was a weapon, waiting for the knocking to eventually stop. When the sun finally rose, I mustered up the courage to leave my room. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet. I went straight to the front desk, demanding to know who was in room 211. The clerk looked confused. "Room 211? That room's been out of service for months. No one's checked in there." I didn't bother arguing. I grabbed my things, checked out, and never looked back. but sometimes, on sleepless nights, I still hear 3 knocks at the door, and I wonder who's on the other side. I was on a work trip, driving through a string of small desert towns when the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving me with no choice but to stop for the night. The only place in sight was a dimly lit motel perched on the edge of the highway, its flickering neon sign reading, "Vacancy." The parking lot was empty except for my car and a beat-up old pickup truck. The air was thick with the dry heat of the desert, and the only sound was the distant hum of power lines. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The reception area was unsettlingly quiet, dimly lit by a single buzzing fluorescent bulb. The clerk behind the desk was an older man with sunken eyes and a pale, waxy complexion. His thin, bony fingers drummed slowly on the counter as I approached. "You looking for a room?" he said, his voice raspy, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. Something about him made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at me, his hollow eyes roaming over my face, like he was studying me. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled out an old-fashioned guest book. "Sign here," he muttered. I hesitated for a moment, but signed my name. He handed me a key with a large, tarnished brass tag that read, "Room 8. End of the hall. Don't worry about the noises." I froze. "What noises?" He didn't answer, just tilted his head, that faint smile still on his face. Feeling uneasy, I made my way down the dim corridor to room 8. The hallway was lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The only sound was the faint creak of the old floorboards under my feet. Inside, the room was basic, but clean enough, though something about it felt off. The bed was neatly made, but the corners of the sheets were tucked so tightly, it looked like more of a display than a place someone had actually slept. There was a small dresser, a mirror on the wall, and a single window overlooking an empty parking lot. I locked the door, double-checked it, and tried to shake off the unease. But then I noticed something strange. The mirror on the wall. It was tilted slightly downward, not quite level. Curious, I stepped closer and realized it wasn't just a mirror. It was a two-way mirror. My stomach dropped. Someone could see into the room. I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door, heading straight for the front desk. But the clerk wasn't there. The guest book was gone, and the desk looked spotless, like no one had been there in years. Panicked, I ran outside to my car. Before I could unlock the door, I heard the faint creak of the motel door opening behind me. I turned to see the clerk standing in the doorway, holding the guest book in one hand and an old rusty key in the other. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with that same faint, unnerving smile. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I jumped in my car and sped off, gravel kicking up behind me. The next day, I tried to look up the motel to report what had happened, but there was no record of it anywhere. No phone number, no reviews, nothing. It was like the place didn't even exist. But I know who I saw. And sometimes, when I think about that two-way mirror and the clerk's unsettling smile, I wonder if he's still there, waiting for his next guest. It was late January, and I had just checked into a mid-range hotel outside Denver. The snowstorm outside was relentless, and the roads were nearly impossible to navigate. I'd been driving all day, and this was the only place with vacancies. The hotel wasn't fancy, but it was clean and warm, and that was really all that mattered to me. The room was on the 3rd floor, tucked at the end of a long hallway. The walls were painted a dull beige, the carpet worn, but the bed looked inviting enough. I tossed my bag onto the chair, locked the door, and triple-checked the deadbolt and the chain latch. I've always been cautious of that. I took a hot shower, ordered some food, and settled into bed to watch some television. The storm outside was loud, the wind howling against the windows, but it was oddly comforting. By midnight, I was ready to crash, and then I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a faint scratching noise, like fingernails against wood. I realized it wasn't a dream, and someone was at my front door. I glanced over at the clock, 3:14 a.m. The scratching stopped, but then I heard the faintest jingle, like someone fumbling with keys. I froze, my mind racing. I knew I had locked that door multiple times. Slowly, I crept out of bed and grabbed the lamp from the nightstand. It was the only thing heavy enough to use as a potential weapon. I tiptoed to the door, heart hammering, and looked through the peephole. A man was standing there, his face partially obscured by a hood. He was hunched over, working something into the lock. I backed away, trying not to make a sound, but the floor creaked under my weight. The man stopped. He stood up slowly, his head turning toward the door like he could sense me on the other side. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I've ever felt. No response. Just silence. And then, the chain latch rattled. My blood ran cold. He wasn't trying to just pick the lock. He was trying to bypass the chain. I grabbed my phone, hand shaking, and dialed the front desk. It rang and rang, but no one picked up. I tried calling 911, but the signal was weak, and the call wouldn't go through. The rattling finally stopped. For a moment, I thought he might have left, and then I heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from the window. My room was on the 3rd floor. There was no way anyone could climb up there, or so I thought. I turned to see a shadow outside the window. A hand was pressed against the glass, leaving a smeared print in the condensation. I ran to the window and yanked the curtains closed, then pushed the dresser in front of it. My breathing was loud in the silence, but I forced myself to listen for any sound. The doorknob rattled again, more violently this time. The man was back at the door, pounding on it now. "Open up!" He growled, his voice low and angry. I screamed, hoping to scare him off or alert someone, but the pounding continued. The door shuddered, the chain barely holding on. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Complete silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, clutching the lamp, staring at the door. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek through the peephole again, and the hallway was empty. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I went straight to the front desk to report what had happened. The receptionist, who was a young woman who looked barely awake, frowned and checked her records. "There's no one staying on your floor except you, sir," she said. I demanded they check the security footage. She hesitated, but eventually she obliged. When we reviewed the tape, my stomach turned. The camera showed a man in a hooded jacket pacing the third-floor hallway, stopping in front of my door. But then, at one point, he looked directly into the camera. His face was pale, his eyes dark, and his lips twisted into a cruel smile. What happened next is what I'll never forget. The man didn't leave through the stairway or the elevator. He walked to the end of the hallway and vanished. I checked out immediately. To this day, I don't know who or what tried to get into my hotel room that night, but I never stay in hotels without a second lock now.